Hi, everybody. Today is Tuesday, June 16th, and you are all at the Kubernetes SIG Testing bi-weekly meeting. We adhere to the Kubernetes Code of Conduct at this meeting. Basically means be your very best self, and we are recording this meeting so that it can be posted to YouTube publicly later. I am your host, Aaron Quickenberger, and we have a couple things on the agenda today. First off, George is here to talk about some of the testing commons plans for 119. On it, we'll talk about an updated proposal for Qtest 2, and Michael Dresser will talk about a proposal for the GCE deployer for Qtest 2. So with that, I will hand it off to George.
Thank you very much. So just to pick it up, and I'm gonna be a little bit more. I'm gonna be a little bit verbose, just to make sure that I don't lose track of any important details for this work for the testing commons plan. So overall, one huge thing that we want to do in testing commons is to clean up the end-to-end test framework, which is located under KK test E2E framework. That whole piece of code, we want to make sure that it is well maintained, it's readable, that people can actually take a look at it, know, and at least understand it, and to work on it as much as possible to prevent any obscure bugs. To that end, we were thinking about proposing the move to staging. So move the test framework from KK test E2E framework into some place into the staging directory. The biggest motivation for really having it into staging is so that people who are already importing the framework, they can do so without actually importing the rest of Kubernetes itself. So they just have that handful of utility test functions, which are used for end-to-end test. And for the most part, a lot of people actually import that framework because they are using the what is called the test context, which is essentially a configuration that lives within the test framework, and it is used in conjunction with a lot of other utilities we use for end-to-end test. So people might already have a lot of tools built to essentially replicate end-to-end test and jobs in the way that they run in KK. They might replicate the same workflow in some CSI plugin and the like, and that's why they import it. So that was the proposal, and we wrote we wrote a cap. We testing commons. I'm gonna say we wrote a cap detailing some of that. It didn't actually make it into 119, and we are hoping to push it into 120. And for the most part, I also so besides asking for reviews of the cap, please, any comments, questions, suggestions, criticisms are more than welcome. And the plan is to have it for 120, all set up and ready for testing commons to do something that's going to make the framework better. But for right now, for 119, I also wanted to ask and throw ideas of under the premise that moving the framework to staging, it's going to be useful and it is something that we should do. And that really based on the fact that it is really pragmatic. A lot of Ginkgo is, some people like it, some people don't like it as much. And the test context that lives that is the core of the framework. Same thing. Some people live with it. Some people have some other opinions. This whole move is again purely pragmatic. It is I think it is a hope for a lot of people that we can build on it and improve on it once we actually clean it up and decouple it from the rest of Kubernetes. But for right now, we just want to decouple it to allow for that work to be easier in the future. So I guess like that first idea of just making this move purely pragmatic and trying to solve these issues. Does anyone have any comments, questions, thoughts?
I feel like I do, but I don't know how to verbalize them. I'm sorry. I guess, so in order to move the framework to staging, like one of the key components is making sure that we don't import anything else from Kubernetes, right? But
Yes.
a number of the pieces that are currently imported into framework come from other directories in the test directory. So I feel like there's going to have to be, I wasn't sure if the KEP talked specifically about that stuff. So some of the utilities around like image manifests and things like that, which are shared across a number of other pieces of testing code. I don't know. I agree. The framework as a whole is probably useful, but I've started to learn more about like how it's wired up and how it's used, and it still feels really heavy.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. So this goes into another thing that I also wanted to mention. So the framework, it's purely what's in KK test E2E framework. There are a lot of dependencies on things from the core, from the more core Kubernetes. For example, we might import some code from package kubelet, and that is used to make sure that pods meet some condition during a test. And that is kind of that might be like a workaround instead of actually using client Go. And that is like one kind of external dependencies that we have. The other kind is like you mentioned, where we have some other end-to-end test or some some Go package that has a bunch of utility functions, but it lives somewhere in test E2E apps. Just to say just to make an example, and the framework might actually import the KK test T3 apps / common. It might import it, and we also consider that as an external dependency. And part of the plan was to make the move onto staging the very last part of the work. So kind of borrowing the idea of the feature gates, even though this wouldn't be under a feature gate. Like the first phase for one release, we make sure to organize everything in the test directory to make sure that we keep the things that should be in the framework within the framework, and then we reorganize utility functions in some other way. If they are used a lot, we move them into the framework so that other people can use them from the framework. If they are only used in one place by one particular set of tests, then we refactor the framework to move that piece of code into the test package where it is actually used. And for external dependencies, for example, something that might be in package, kubelet, CPU manager, we make sure to try and use the client Go or some more official way of actually doing an operation. And in terms of code, that is the main idea. Where the first couple stages, for example, in 120 and 121, we focus on just refactoring everything to make the we refactor everything just in terms of code organization to keep the framework small, concise, and and to the point, I guess. And then once we actually get to that, we just bump it into staging.
Don't we intentionally not use client Go? I guess I have two other concerns. One is that test context thing, which is something of a mess itself, also exposes things like the cloud providers, and that I think I would at least want us to have some messaging that we are staging this and making it available to projects because they are using it today, but this is not like an endorsement that third parties should look to this as the way to do their testing. Like if we had the time, I don't think we'd be continuing to invest more in Ginkgo. I was talking with Aaron yesterday about like the stringly type testing as an example and the regex filtering on it and how difficult that is to work with. I really think if we were promoting a best practices framework, it wouldn't look like what we wound up with today because it just kind of happened. I don't think there was a lot of planning involved. So while I'm not super opposed to staging it, I kind of want some notice about like maybe the motivation or something, just so that people get context that like if they're coming looking for like what does Kubernetes SIG testing say you should do, I don't think I would actually tell a new project to start from this framework or Ginkgo for that matter.
And that I think I think it makes sense. And the only thing that I can add on that is that that was also kind of the motivation, and for the most part, within the framework we have the test context and everything around the test context, which might be which we hope we can improve it at some later point whenever the framework is a little bit cleaner. But then the rest of the code is a lot of utility functions, which they're not super rocket science, but they are still useful, and people that are useful throughout of the.
Right, but I mean,
Yeah.
once you do stage it, it's an API now, and you removing things from the test context will be breaking for users, including the Kubernetes test. And because those things are not rocket science, I still want to suggest that it might make sense to kind of lift the things that are useful but not rocket science into a new repo with some actual design behind the framework and say like this is best practices. I understand though that there's kind of two things going on here. One is if someone comes along and they say I need to test my Kubernetes thing and they're not doing it yet. And the other one is all these projects that have already started depending on Kubernetes, which was not supported ever, but they're doing it and they're kind of first party-ish like CSI, and they're blocked on this. That said, also, had they asked us in the past, I would have said that SIG architecture also says that depending on Kubernetes is not supported. You need to stage it to begin with. So it kind of seems like we're sending the wrong signal here. That we're just going to stage everything anyone depends on, and that like that this is like our framework. And while we have wound up with this in Kubernetes, even in Kubernetes, I would like to replace it. So I don't know if maybe there's some way we can, go forward with staging, but kind of note that it's not necessarily endorsed as like the way to do these things.
I feel like we've had this discussion before about concerns that staging has grown organically and that continued investment of it would be better spent elsewhere. And I just feel like I see see that people are using this. So I don't want to necessarily block. If you are so motivated to try and invest your time in this, I don't want to block you from that. I guess I do personally wonder if the time could be better spent planning a framework that was a little less organically grown. We actually tried to do that under Testing Commons about a year ago next month. And that ended up going nowhere. So I recognize this is kind of the test framework that we have. I guess, so, and right now I think like working to continue to untangle the dependency tree of the framework would be helpful. As I expressed earlier, I have concerns that untangling of some of the test utilities will be tricky. The issue that I have is that the framework is intended for end-to-end tests only. And I wouldn't want to see utility code that is useful for tests of a different sort or access to different functions get bundled up in the E2E framework just because it has the word framework in it. But I think that's something we can only discover by going through this.
Can I make a suggestion?
I'm surprised.
So before this discussion started, the question I wanted to ask George was, what are the learning resources for the framework, for the end-to-end testing framework, and where could I learn about this to basically write some end-to-end tests using Ginkgo? So that question still stands, but from listening to this subsequent discussion, I think it might be important to address Ben's concerns by a couple of means. One, to provide an overview of how we arrived here and describe the story of how this framework came about in such a way as to go, you know, this is what's used, here's some weaknesses, this is why we're here, we might want to be in a different place, but this is where we are. And if that was described well, then I think that would signpost maybe enough warnings for third parties to embrace or not embrace the framework.
I mean, and also that may not necessarily be a fair thing to do, but that's my opinion, is that I would, like, if someone came to me and they said, like, I need to test my Kubernetes project, I need to build some component and I need to end-to-end test it. I have actually done this in the past. Some of our partner projects that otherwise would have worked on something else, and we hope to learn from that. Like Knative is an example. They did a pretty extensive framework evaluation of their own and settled on, as much as they'd like to reuse things, they were not going to work with Ginkgo and this framework, and they built something much thinner around like standard code testing stuff, I believe. I had always planned to come back and build something from that, but it just hasn't been prioritized yet. But because even the framework we have.
Yeah, but even to tell those stories, like, I mean, yeah, it's the old joke when you ask an old cruiser in Ireland for directions, he'll turn around and say, well, I wouldn't start from here. Yeah, like, I mean, so, like, I mean, if that is the case, then we should say that, and point to examples where, you know, point to that example and say, you could look here, you could look there. And ultimately, I think there's two things. People are fairly good at making a call on whether or not to take on a tool or not take on a tool, and whether to build versus buy or improve versus build something new. But I think the concern about, would the real concern about staging be that, okay, this is an endorsement, this is an agreement to support? Is that the real concern?
Support some, and then just that, like, I do think people kind of cargo cult what Upstream's doing, and I hate for the first impression from some external project of SIG testing to be like diving through like, we don't currently actually own most of the E2E tests, and we nominally own the framework, but for a long time the SIG was not, like, when I joined years ago, the SIG was not really active in that. pretty much all the other SIGs going about and writing whatever they wanted. And I would say that like the tests themselves don't behave well. The test system overall is difficult to work with and debug. It's difficult to select the tests you want because it's all just like regexes of like focus and skip. And like we've sort of developed this ad hoc like stringly typed thing that we don't really document. I was explaining some yesterday, and like the output of the failures tends to be difficult to parse and unintuitive English. And just like in general, I think it's overwhelming, and I frequently see people that are like experienced in the project still confused by failures. So this being even easier for some third party to come along and adopt and have that be their impression of SIG testing feels kind of bad. On the other hand, like I understand the motivations of like the projects that are already using it and like the need to have something, and that I'm not saying that I'm gonna tomorrow write a different one, but I just wonder if we can find some way to suggest too that I also don't think this should be really strongly for external use. I think it still needs to, like, if we need a change for Kubernetes testing, that has to happen, and like external consumers are just going to have to deal with it. And whereas normally I would expect like an external repo to have versioning and avoid breakage.
So I personally feel like we've beaten the dead horse of moving this to staging creates an API that we're not willing to support, and we have all sorts of things that we don't like about this framework. I get it. I still don't think I should use that as a blocker for those who are motivated to try and reduce the tangles of dependencies that this creates, and we can reevaluate whether, once the untangling has been done, to make it possible to move this to staging, if moving it to staging is a good idea. I kind of wanted to be respectful of the time that we have left. I had sort of budgeted like 30 minutes for this discussion and maybe 15 for each of the following proposals. So I wanted to make sure George got whatever action he wanted out of this. And I personally had a question around one of the proposed issues to work on, which was 8125. So it's this idea that the core E2E framework shouldn't import any of the packages underneath of it. So there's been a lot of work around taking some of these brain dead utilities that they used to all live in inside of the framework package, and have gradually been refactored into E2E framework pod, E2E framework auth, E2E framework storage. So if you're writing a test and you want to do something with the pod, maybe you go take a look at the pod package and you have a clean list of utility functions you could use. That's great. That's awesome. Unfortunately, in the work to shuffle all this stuff around, folks started to trip upon the fact that because everything was in a single package, not a lot of thought was given to dependency cycles between all of the various things. And as we've tried to export or refactor things into packages, we started discovering that. So what this issue proposes is one way to avoid cycles is to say that the framework can't import any package that's underneath of it, but then packages that are underneath of it can import the framework so that they get access to some of the framework's core stuff. This is most often used for access to the framework's logging functions and for access to some of the expect not equals, expect equals, shortcut functions that we've used to wrap Ginkgo. I don't know if that's enough context for folks to understand what I'm talking about, but my concern is that feels like the opposite direction of what we want to do. Patrick Oley was the guy from SIG Storage who ended up refactoring a lot of framework to move it to try and get it set up to move to staging. And in the issue that talks about moving to staging, sort of lays out the plan that what would be ideal is if if framework was allowed to import packages underneath of it, but the packages underneath the framework weren't allowed to import anything from their parent directories. This would mean that the directory tree kind of mirrors the dependency tree. and would make things nicely coupled. I care about this right now because I want to be able to provide access to the test files package from within Framework. And I can't because importing test files creates a dependency because test files imports log and stuff. I was curious like how much active discussion went into the direction, like how we're dealing with dependency cycles. And
Sorry for cutting you off. The context that I can provide is that the design for that whole idea where the core framework can import subpackages, but subpackages are not supposed to import the core framework. It was actually designed to kind of play along with the idea that we eventually want to make the framework a standalone thing that you can import without actually importing the rest of Kubernetes. And the mentality was if you for the most part, if anybody wants to actually use the framework, the piece that they are definitely looking for is it's going to be the test context, because it has all the configuration to things that you can do with end-to-end test. And we wanted to at least the goal was to make sure that the core framework only contained all the logic for people to be able to get the test context, do some logging and error handling, and these two things really depend a lot on Ginkgo and Klog and the like. And if that's all you wanted, then that's all you get. Then if you were testing stateful sets, you can import the utility functions from E2E STS. If you want to do something with pods, you import E2E pods. And I guess to completely answer that question will be that if we made it the other way around, where for example, E2E pods, which is a subpackage of the framework, actually imported the core framework. I'm trying to think of this right now.
I guess maybe my meta point here is I don't recall seeing a design doc that like laid this stuff out. It was context I've had to try and pick up through a trail of GitHub issues, which linked to discussions in Slack, which ran across different months and weeks and days and Slack threads and stuff. And so as we talk about wanting to move forward and to like decouple things to get this ready for staging, I think it would be helpful to see a little more planning and vision around that, which would maybe help address some of Rob's concerns around documentation about like what the intent of the framework is. You know, a bit of a like, here's how we got to now, sorry, but here's like where we're planning on heading, to maybe help us with just kind of documenting what we believe our best practices are and what rules and design conventions we are trying to enforce. And I think you and I can take my particular case offline and see if there's a way to work through that. But
yes, I agree to everything you said.
Oh, sorry, guys. I'd be keen to help out with that, Aaron.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you need to move forward, George?
So just to move forward, because so in terms of the I guess the implementation details and everything that you just mentioned about documenting it, definitely think it's something that we should do. Implementation details, something that I also think should be documented and more discussed. But overall, really just taking what we have, making it a little bit more consumable for the people that are already using it, and with that premise, moving forward with the KEP on staging the framework, would that be the reason? Would that be the reasonable thing, or should we really spend more cycles on just starting from scratch?
Well, I personally am not sold on the KEP to move it to staging. I would like to understand what the framework looks like. Like we know what dependencies we have to untangle in order to move it to staging. I feel like I would like to see us plan that out a little more. And so some of that we're going to do by doing some of the work you have proposed to try shuffling things around. But we're also going to sort of document why we're doing the things we're doing and what end state we expect to get at. And then I think we can have a better idea of whether moving this to staging is something that we're okay with or willing to support, or if we put a huge disclaimer saying, warning, this is actually completely unsupported. It's just been gradually shoved to staging by these few contributors here, use at your own peril, like whatever. I always think there's work in finding a simpler way, but I, like Ben, am not going to be the person to invest the time in doing it, and I don't think I should be forcing you to do that either. This is, again, just sort of our opinion, born out of we feel like there's probably a better way than in the hodgepodge, but in the tangled mess that we have, but like if that's what we're going to go with, if you want that allows you to do incremental, iterative progress, then let's not block you.
Okay, so that sounds reasonable, and really looking for the way forward for testing commons. So, from my perspective, I feel like a lot of what you just mentioned should be part of the. I feel like a lot of the refactoring and everything that you should mention, it's work that we should do regardless of the KEP. In terms of just making the framework more consumable. Would that be a correct assumption?
Yeah, I think so, and it would be great to have a place to understand the full vision of that work.
Okay, sounds perfect. And thank you very much for everything. That definitely helps, because I kind of bundle all of this with the actual moving to staging with the KEP, and I just wanted to verify that the last couple things of the work that we should mention about really making really having a clear design. I wanted to make sure that we could move forward and start that work right now, and not just. I wanted to make sure that we could start that work right now.
Yeah. Okay, I'll follow up with you offline on those specific topics.
Thank you.
So, Amit, would you like to talk to us about your proposal for Kube Test 2? And I can give you screen sharing access if you need it.
Yeah. Or I guess you could share it if you have the doc.
Go ahead. It's all good. You should be able to share your screen now.
I don't think. Is it? Can you see the screen now?
I cannot.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I can still.
I can. You just want me to share the doc?
Yeah, you can just share the doc.
Sure. I will be your virtual mouse. Give me a second.
Thank you.
Okay. Can folks see that? Okay.
Okay, yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so for folks who don't know, Kube Test 2 was one of the projects that we started around a year back, and it was basically meant as sort of a replacement for Kube Test, and that's because Kube Test suffered a variety of problems because it became a tangled mess it sort of organically grew because all of the deployed logic is consolidated in this monolithic binary. And that sort of led to why we created kubetest2 in the first place. To add to that, this is sort of just an updated list of proposals that we should look at as SIG testing to make sure that we follow through on what we decided regarding kubetest2, just so that we can sort of solve the whole kubetest2 and make it more easier to use. So there are sort of three objectives that I was looking at in terms of the new updated kubetest2 proposal. One of them being to also decouple the tester lifecycle from the deployed lifecycle. So in the initial design doc, the main motivation of moving to kubetest2 was separating out the deployed logic from the core kubetest binary. And that just means that each individual deployer has its sort of own binary that has the logic for whatever it does to create a cluster. And that does not touch the code for any other deployers. So previously in kubetest, all the deployed logic was in sort of this one binary, which had thousands of flags to select which deployer, and then the specific deployer customization was done via thousands of flags, and they were all in this one binary, which is why we sort of removed the deployers uh, from the main kubetest binary. What this proposal is asking us to do is we should also decouple the testers. So in the initial proposal, the testers were still implemented as packages inside which the deployer then called. Instead, we should also decouple the testers into separate binaries. And the way kubetest2 calls these binaries is it uses a plugin model similar to what kubectl does. So if the deployer is named kubetest2 dash deployer name, then kubetest2 basically calls the deployer in its lifecycle. The second objective was to make sure that it's extensible. So all the deployers that kubetest2 supports right now are implemented in test infra entry, and which really made it difficult for other providers or deployers to make use of this quote unquote framework. But we sort of want to improve that position and make sure that we have sort of standard way to test Kubernetes instead of having like bespoke tools that create their own life cycles just to test just to test Kubernetes end to end. And then the third main objective was the reusability. If anyone has tried using kubetest locally, it's a real pain. And then most likely people refer a job in a CI job in the proc config and try to replicate that locally, and it doesn't work because stuff works differently in CI than in local. So this is sort of one of the things that we should fix, is that we should firstly identify that the local use cases is bound to be different than the CI use case. And then we should try to make sure that it works for both the use cases. So that's like one of the objectives that I wanted to tackle. And so with these objectives in mind, there were a couple of proposals that I added in this doc. Uh, Firstly, the first proposal is mainly to make sure that we mark kubetest explicitly in maintenance mode. So it has been in maintenance mode sort of for a couple of months now, which means basically no one has been adding any features to it. And then only bug fixes are being allowed to go in. Uh, I think if we are planning to move to the kubetest2 world, we should at least start acknowledging that kubetest2 is no longer supported. Kubetest 1 is no longer supported, and sort of sort of documented somewhere. And we've done this something similar to the scenario script that we have in our Bootstrap lifecycle. So this is just making sure that we document that. The next two proposals deal with the naming scheme for the deployers and testers. So as I said, mentioned earlier, kubetest 2 uses the plugin model, but previously only deployers were separate binaries and testers were in tree packages. But now that we are planning to move out the deployers, we should also think about naming the deployers and testers separately. And the way we can do that is basically just add a kubetest2 deployer in front of the provider name and then kubetest2 tester in front of the tester name. The first one is not really necessary, as Ben pointed out, but I think in terms of consistency, it's just better to have this sort of distinction between the deployers and testers. The next proposal is about making this an official sub-project. So one of the reasons why kubetest became such a tangled mess was a certain lack of ownership or sort of maintenance from SIG testing perspective. So for all intents and purposes, it was a simple project that people added ad hoc deployer implementations to just to make their E2E tests work. And it was just something in test infra that people added logic to their specific logic to when things broke. But in sort of in terms of having a good maintenance lifecycle, we should probably think about moving this to out of test infra so that we can provide a correct uh, support model. And one of the big drivers to that is just installing kubetest2. We rely on go getting just go get test infra kubetest2. And right now, go get doesn't really work with test infra for some weird reasons. So that's also one of the drivers why we should consider moving it out. And then also try to make this a sub project. The next two proposals deal with how we would sort of model the releases and how we would share, like how we would distribute the kubetest2 binaries, the kubetest2 core binary itself and the deployer and tester binaries for using in CI or like using locally. The first one talks about how we should mimic the Kubernetes release cycle. The reason for that is currently we already have separate jobs for separate release branches, and they are mainly this is mainly achieved by having different kubekins E2E images that have different dependencies based on the release branches. But previously, kubetest 1 was just working off of head. So any breaking changes that were made in kubetest head also affected all the release branches. So this is sort of also breaking down the kubetest2 deployers and testers and the core binary to also follow the versioning scheme of Kubernetes so that we can use the specific release binaries with the specific release branch testing. And then the CI image that we use, as I said, is kubekins E2E. And it sort of suffers from some of the same problems that kubetest does because it completely relies on the bootstrap image right now. And kubetest2 is like one of the motivations for the initial kubetest2 plan was to get rid of all the layers of scripts that we have in between starting a CI job and actually running the tests against Kubernetes. Uh, so we already have a image that is sort of a stripped down version of kubekins E2E and just has the runtime dependencies, and it's called KRTE. Right now, it's only used by the kind jobs, but we can sort of like piggyback on this image as to form the base for all the kubetest2 images, just so that we are no longer reliant on the kubekins E2E like scripts and Bootstrap and that sort of stuff. And the last, I think, proposal is mainly to sort of document a standard for how the deployer should interact with the testers. And the this was meant to be the most simplistic way and the most robust way of having common deployer tester interface, so that we can actually say that you can use any tester with any deployer as long as they sort of satisfy this constraint. And the only constraint that really makes sense is that the deployer sets up the kubeconfig for tester. And in terms of like without the deployer, if you just wanted to run the tester, that means that you have an existing cluster with kubeconfig, and your tester is running against that existing cluster. So this sort of really demarcates the line between what the deployer should be doing, whereas what the tester should be doing. And then there's sort of I've sort of noted down a couple of irregularities with what we are currently using in CI, is that we still rely on some out of band information that gets passed through inside kubetest internally, which is the number of nodes that the cluster has. And then specifically for the GCE deployer, the node SSH keys that are used to run node E2E tests. So these should be discussed in general, but just to make sure that we are backwards compatible, the independent deployers and testers can like pass information through the artifacts directory that kubetest2 provides. But like kubetest core itself will not expose any environment variables through this way. And that will basically make sure that we are no longer relying on these thousands of environment variables that we rely in the CI currently. The next section just talks about the development guide. I will not go much into detail. This is basically just best practices for how deployers and testers can be implemented to follow sort of what the above proposals meant to achieve. And then the last part basically deals with something what we should look at in terms of something in future. One thing is native Bosco support. So right now, kubetest2 core doesn't really support Boscos, and then it's up to the individual deployers to like have the Boscos client to make sure they get the resources such as GCP project that we use in CI. We should sort of try to identify a common use case. For example, we rely on the heartbeat lifecycle of like Reaper, Janitor, the entire Boscos lifecycle that we use in CI. So if we can identify some specific set of resources that we support, then we can probably move the individual Boscos client outside into the kubetest2 core. The second one was why not just have a common build implementation? This is because different deployers do rely on different build logic. It's not just building the core Kubernetes binary from KK. For example, kind also needs to build the node image. That being said, most likely in most deployer cases, it is going to be the case that we want to build KK from head or like from existing releases. So we can think about moving out the common build implementation as packages inside kubetest2 core. Yeah. And then the last but not the least is whether or not we want to rename kubetest2. And I just sort of added a call to vote there if people wanted to add their suggestions or just wanted to +1 any of the suggestions below. So feel free to add that. And yeah, that's mostly what I had.
Thanks for presenting that.
I would normally ask for questions, but at this point, I will also want to make sure that Michael Dresser gets a chance to talk about the specific cube test to deployer. Let's see, Michael, do you want me to share your doc as well?
I'm sure I can try to share it as well. I'm not sure if it'll work. My Zoom is being a bit odd.
I have this locked down so people can't share unless I make them co-host. So try now.
All right, let's see. I think this is what I want.
Yep, I see it.
Fantastic. Okay. I won't take too much of your time because a lot of this doc is technical details that are not that important for this discussion, but I'll just highlight a couple of things. So as Amit said, kubetest 2 has deployers that are sort of separate components. This is one for GCE. A very, very, very large number of our end-to-end tests run on GCE clusters. So this is an attempt to sort of split the kubetest. Sorry, what?
I said, sorry, we're looking at, I wasn't sure if you had a window with your design proposal. We're looking at the meeting notes.
Oh, I do. I think I shared the wrong screen.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Sorry about that. No, that's all right. There we go. This is the one.
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So this is a deployer for GCE, which is a lot of what our end-to-end tests run on. You can see this rough flow chart. The red parts here are bash scripts. This is the original kubeflow. And if we have GCE, their kubetest 2 will look like. We're eliminating like 2-ish bash scripts in between, which should reduce complexity a lot and bring us sort of in line with this new framework for our end-to-end testing. So a lot of further suggestions are very specific, going to like what kubetest provides as functionality, what we're going to mirror, and then how we're going to start migrating tests. You're through and make suggestions and comments on very specific technical details, but I don't think that's worth going to very discussion on. I am most interesting conversation how we're going to migrate existing end-to-end tests to using kubetest 2 and using the deployer. And I know some of this is covered in documents that Amit has, but because GCE-based end-to-end testing is so critical for a lot of our stuff, it's really worth thinking about how we're going to move tests over to this. My proposal suggests that we migrate groups of tests in a sort of a sliding window. So, you know, the first time we just maybe pick 3 tests, let's say, and monitor them for a while. So we basically make a duplicate of the test that uses kubetest 2 and watch it alongside the original standard kubetest-based test, see how it does, and if it meets, you know, if they keep parity with results for a certain period of time, that is the window time, we will then sunset the old style kubetest-based test and keep the kubetest 2 test as the primary test. And we could just do that eventually for the full suite of tests, which obviously takes a while, but I think it's worth taking the sort of slower, more methodical approach so that we're not blowing things up, especially given the fact that we have a release code coming up. I outlined brief sort of what tests we're interested in replacing to start with, which are pre-submits primarily, though we'll also check out periodics. And I would be very interested to hear if anyone has a better session for testing in general, because it's pertinent to this proposal. I'll take any questions if you guys have any.
I think my one comment would be probably at some point it makes sense to stop mirroring all of them. Like once we have a decent amount of confidence that we've moved a lot of things, we can probably just move them and keep an eye on the move.
Perfect. That makes sense.
Yeah, like I expressed in the doc, I think Generating data that proves that these are relatively equivalent is helpful. I'm also going to be respectful of the 119 release team if they decide they don't want us changing some part of how the jobs are run as we get closer to deadlines like code freeze and test freeze and stuff like that. We try to be a little mindful of not making like high-risk changes when they're looking for periods of stability. But I think that this sliding window approach provides sort of maximum transparency to help them make the call.
Yeah, that's fair.
And the advantages.
Migration during code freeze.
We can always shadow tests during a freeze because it's only signal anything away. So we can gather data about the effectors in a limited capacity.
I guess another quick question. In order for this to continue to function with the Oracle legacy implementation of things, it sounds like this is going to be setting more environment variables than just food config for the time being, which sounds like it's in direct contradiction to what Amit was proposing earlier. I'm assuming we're going to plan to like gradually replace those environment variables with something else as we work to create a test2 tester for this stuff.
So if I'm catching, okay, so could you sort of rephrase that? I'm not exactly sure what you're getting at. What environment variables are you talking about specifically?
So for example, kubessh bastion is an environment variable you call out, which you say,
Yes.
which the doc says should be deprecated as soon as possible, but it's possible that there are tests that rely on this. So this would be an example of where the deployer is going to need to set an environment variable for something to consume down the line.
Okay, I see what you're saying. So cube up and cube down are configured like purely through environment variables, right? And this is something to like investigate. Like the SSH bastion environment is something that needs sort of some introspection, I think, to find specific tests that use it. But because cube up and cube down have to be configured with environment variables, we're just making it so that we're not making the user set environment variables with like kubetest has like a --env flag, which is not great. So we're going to try to like provide an interface that's just like flags that specify specific options. We have to set environment variables in cube and cube down on this actual bash script, but the goal is to not affect the environment at all after that.
We could also allow them to be passed down just as real environment variables. I think the problem with that is it makes it difficult to replicate a proud job locally, because now you need to go like you need to, as a human, go find all the environment variables that were set in the job and set them. Whereas if they're flags, you can like cut and paste it from the build log.
Yeah, that's the goal is that, and also just not having the --n flag of kubetest2, because then you're just setting arbitrary environment variables, which can be kind of weird.
Okay, cool. I kind of want to call, we're at time at this point. So if folks have any questions, please follow up with us on the document or in Slack or on our mailing list. I appreciate all of you showing up today and look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks.
Especially thanks to everyone who presented, and George in particular for coming in, like circling back the Testing Commons project here so we can debate staging once again.
Okay, happy to.